The deed. The auction was already over, at least in the mind of the man running it. The folding table at the front of the room held a leather portfolio, 2 pens, and a stack of documents bound with a blue rubber band. The attorney, whose name was Caldwell, had come down from Boston for this. He had driven 2.5 hours through the Connecticut Hill Country on a gray Tuesday morning in November to close the sale of a rural property in a town most people at his firm had never heard of and would not remember hearing about after today. He had not brought a change of clothes. He had not booked a lunch table anywhere in the county. He had expected to be back on the highway by noon and back at his desk in Boston by 2:30 in time to review the Merit Holdings commercial lease before the end of business. His client, Sauer Contracting, had submitted the winning bid of $41,000 for the Holloway farm, 32 acres of fallow pasture, a farmhouse badly in need of a new roof, and all structures thereon. Brent Sauer himself was seated in the second row, a solid man in his mid-50s with a contractor's hands and a contractor's patience and the quiet practice satisfaction of a man who had spotted an opportunity and moved on it cleanly. He had already spoken to an excavating crew in Torrington. He had sketched rough ideas for 3 spec houses on a legal pad the previous Thursday evening after dinner, sitting at the kitchen table of his own house with a glass of iced tea at his elbow, the kind of house that was solid and paid for and belonged to him without complication, and he had felt the specific satisfaction of a man whose life added up in a way he could account for. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical man. There was a difference. Caldwell moved through the final steps with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times. Distressed rural properties, aging estates, foreclosures on land that had been in families for generations. He processed the paperwork of human circumstance without much ceremony and without much sentiment. It was a necessary function he had long ago decided. Someone had to do it. The economy required the orderly transfer of encumbered assets. He did not lie awake about it at night. He had other things to lie awake about, and he kept them in a separate compartment, which was the only way to do the work he did at the volume he did it. The room was a community hall on the edge of town, the kind of building that had been built in the early 1950s and maintained through decades of town appropriations that were always slightly insufficient, so that it never fell apart entirely, but never got better either. It smelled of old carpet and folding tables and industrial coffee left too long on a burner. A folded American flag stood in one corner, its fringe slightly dusty, its fabric faded along the top edge, where the light from a narrow window had reached it for many years. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, 2 of them blinking faintly at the far end of the room in a rhythm that was almost but not quite periodic. Mismatched folding chairs held perhaps 24 people, mostly neighbors, the kind who come to these proceedings not to bid, but to witness, because in small towns, a foreclosure auction is a community event, even when no one wants to admit that it is one. Several wore work coats still damp at the shoulders from the gray morning outside. A few had mud on their boots from the parking lot, which was unpaved and had absorbed several days of late autumn rain. Their hands were folded in their laps or resting flat on their knees. They watched with the quiet, steady attention of people who understood that something sad was happening and who had come anyway, because that is what you do when a neighbor's land is on the block. You show up. It does not change the outcome, but it matters that you showed up. Caldwell reached for the transfer documents. He uncapped his pen. Then a voice came from the back of the room. Not loud, not sharp, not the voice of a person who was angry or frightened or performing for an audience. It was the voice of a person who had decided something, who had decided it carefully and with full deliberation over many weeks, and who was now simply saying it aloud in the way that you state a fact that you know to be a fact, without drama, without inflection, without anything more than the calm certainty of someone who has done their homework. Stop the filing. The pen in Caldwell's hand did not move. The room went absolutely still. He looked up. She was standing at the very back near the door, a woman perhaps in her early 70s, small in frame but completely entirely still, the kind of stillness that is not passivity, but its precise opposite, a stillness that comes from having made up your mind and having no further need to fidget or hesitate. She wore a clean cotton blouse with a pale blue floral print, the kind of blouse that had been washed many times and ironed that morning and had retained its dignity through both. Her silver hair was pinned simply at the back of her neck. She held a worn leather handbag in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. The paper was yellowed and small, pressed into a neat square by decades of being kept precisely folded in precisely the same way. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She looked like a woman who had been waiting her turn to speak and whose turn had now arrived and who intended to use it. Her name was Margaret Holloway. Everyone in that room, everyone in that town, everyone in the township going back 41 years called her Maggie. She had lived on that land since the autumn of 1984, when she and Roy had moved out of the rental house in town and into the farmhouse that Roy had spent 14 months renovating, working on it evenings and weekends, with the particular thoroughness of a man who intended to live in it for the rest of his life and wanted to do the job right. She had raised a son there. She had planted a kitchen garden there every April for 30 years and watched it grow and decline each fall with the reliable seasonality of things you plant in good faith and tend carefully and cannot ultimately control. She had buried a husband there in the winter of 2019 in a small ceremony at the Methodist church in town on a Thursday morning when the ground was frozen hard and the sky was the flat white color of old bone. And afterwards, she had come home alone to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She did not drink and looked out the window at the barn across the yard and thought, he built that. He built all of it, and now it is mine to keep. She had known even then that keeping it would not be simple. That sale is not final, she said. Her voice carried without effort across the quiet room, not because she raised it, but because the room had become the kind of still that carries sound without resistance. The barn is not part of Parcel 4A. A ripple moved through the seated crowd, not a commotion, something smaller and more deliberate than that, a collective shift, the quiet adjustment of people recalibrating what they had assumed was settled. Chairs moved slightly. Someone coughed. Two people near the window exchanged a look. Brent Sauer's expression changed slowly the way a practical man's expression changes when he begins to suspect that something he counted as simple may not be simple at all. He did not look angry. He looked careful, which is what a practical man looks when surprise enters a situation he thought he had mapped correctly. Caldwell set down his pen with deliberate calm. He was a man who had weathered many disruptions at proceedings like this one. Old claims resurfacing at the last moment, estranged relatives appearing with grievances that had been nursed in private for years, neighbors asserting easements that no survey could locate. He had a practiced response for all of it. He arranged his face into an expression that combined professional patience with gentle authority, the expression of a man who is about to explain something regrettable to someone who does not fully understand the situation, but who cannot be faulted for trying. "Ma'am," he said, projecting his voice across the room with the easy confidence of the most credentialed person present. "The auction for Parcel 4A has been concluded. The property, including all structures thereon, has been legally sold. The documents are in order." He gestured toward the stack of papers on the table, as if their bulk and their blue rubber band constituted some form of argument. Maggie Holloway walked forward. She did not hurry. She moved at the pace of a woman who had calculated the distance to her destination and had no reason to rush. Her shoes made a soft sound on the worn linoleum floor. The crowd shifted to make way for her without appearing to notice that they were doing it the way water divides for something moving through it with sufficient certainty. She reached the folding table and placed the document she had been holding on its surface between Caldwell's leather portfolio and his stack of papers. The paper was yellowed, its folds deep and permanent, pressed into the grain of the document by decades of being kept precisely folded in precisely the same way in a tin lockbox on a high shelf in the barn, in the dark and the dry. The typing at the top was faded but legible black ribbon ink on good weight paper, the kind that aged with more integrity than the cheap stock that had replaced it everywhere by the late 1980s. She did not speak immediately. She let the document rest there on the table in the fluorescent light, and she let the room have a moment to take it in. "Filing 83-D-114, she said. "It established a separate recorded deed for Parcel 9-2 in 1985. The barn sits on that parcel. The deed is in my husband's name. It was never extinguished. It is the record." To understand what she was holding and what it meant and why she had driven 12 miles on a gray Tuesday morning to sit in a folding chair at the back of a community hall and wait for exactly the right moment to speak, you had to go back more than 40 years. You had to go back to a man named Roy Holloway And you had to understand something about the way Roy Holloway moved through the world, because the piece of paper on that table was not really a legal document, or not only a legal document, it was a form of speech. It was Roy talking from the winter of 1983 in the only language he had ever fully trusted. Roy Holloway had been born in 1948 in a small town in western Connecticut to a father who was a carpenter and a grandfather who had been a carpenter before him. He grew up in a house that his grandfather had built with his own hands from local timber, a house that was still standing when Roy was a boy, and that Roy used to visit on Sunday afternoons with a child's open attention, running his hands along the joints, in the framing members, in the places where the old man had addressed problems of structure with solutions that were both functional and, Roy thought, even then, quietly beautiful. His grandfather had not thought of himself as an artist. He had thought of himself as a man who made things that worked and that lasted, and he had not distinguished much between the two, because in his understanding, they were the same thing. A thing that worked well and was made honestly was beautiful. A thing that was only beautiful and did not work was nothing at all. Roy's father had taught him to work wood in the same tradition, not with formal instruction, which was not how that knowledge moved in that family, but by letting Roy stand at his shoulder and watch and gradually participate, first holding things, then measuring, then cutting simple joints under supervision, then doing whole pieces by himself, and having them examined with the same clear, unsentimentalized eye that Roy's father turned on his own work. Criticism was specific and practical. Praise was rare and therefore meaningful. The standard was not perfection. Perfection was not available to human hands, but the standard was honesty. You did not hide mistakes under filler or finish. You corrected them, or you acknowledged them and understood why they had happened and did not make them again. Roy had carried this forward into everything he did. He had worked construction through his 20s, framing houses, and eventually taking on finished carpentry, and eventually moving into restoration work, the painstaking rehabilitation of old structures that required a different kind of knowledge than new construction, a knowledge of how things had been built in the past and why, and what their deterioration patterns meant, and what they needed to be made sound again without losing what made them worth saving. He was good at it. He was by his late 30s known for it in the counties where he worked. Men called him when they had a problem with an old building because they knew he would tell them the truth about what they had and what it needed, and because his work when he did it held. He had met Maggie in 1978 at a church social in the town where he was then living, a widening suburb south of Hartford that was in the process of losing the character it had had for 100 years and replacing it with the character of everywhere, which is to say no particular character at all. She was 26, he was 30. She had been teaching second grade for 3 years and had the specific kind of patience that comes not from temperament, but from practice, from having spent 3 years in a room with 23 7-year-olds every day and learning out of absolute necessity to distinguish between a problem that needed immediate intervention and a problem that needed only to be watched and given time. She saw in Roy something she would spend years finding language for and eventually stop trying to name. He was not a talkative man, but she noticed early that he expressed himself through what he made and how he made it, a directness and honesty that showed up in his work and in quieter ways in everything else about him. He kept his word. He paid his debts. He told the truth when it was inconvenient, not cruelly but plainly, because he did not know how to be otherwise. These were not things he spoke about. They were things he simply was. They had married in June of 1980 in a small ceremony at the same Methodist church in town, where Roy's funeral would take place 39 years later, though neither of them could have imagined that fact on the morning of their wedding, which was warm and clear, and smelled of cut grass and new flowers and the beginning of something. They had lived for 4 years in a rental house on the edge of town while Roy worked and saved and looked for the right piece of land. He was specific about what he wanted. He wanted acreage enough for a kitchen garden, enough for a barn, enough that the neighbors were not close enough to hear the radio through the wall. He wanted hills. He wanted water either on the property or close to it. He wanted the kind of land that had been farmed before and that had some character built up in it from years of being used and cared for rather than raw land that was only potential. He found it in the spring of 1982, 32 acres in the hill country 2 miles east of the small town of Millhaven, Connecticut. The land had been a working farm through the 1950s and 1960s and had gone fallow in the 1970s when the family that owned it had moved away and could not be persuaded to move back. It had the look of a place that had been let go, but had not given up the pasture grown over with pioneer species, the stone walls intact under the brush, the farmhouse standing but in need of everything. And on the east side of the property, on a slight rise, perhaps 200 yards from the farmhouse, the remains of a barn. Roy stood on that rise on the afternoon he first walked the property and looked at what was left of the old structure and understood immediately and completely what it had been and what it could be. The bones were there. The post and beam framing was old-growth timber, white oak, and chestnut, the kind of wood that was not made anymore in any commercial quantity, that took 200 years to grow to the dimensions required for framing members, and that when it was sound was stronger than anything built after it. The wood was dark with age, but Roy put his hand on it and pressed, and it didn't give. He took out his pocket knife and cut a small notch, and the fibers were intact, bright-colored under the weathered surface. Sound. He walked every inch of that barn that afternoon. He noted what was missing and what needed to be replaced and what needed only to be cleaned and reinforced. He stood in the center of it, in the filtered light coming through gaps where roofing had gone, and he looked up at the framing above him and felt the specific satisfaction of finding something worth saving that was still savable. He and Maggie made an offer on the property that same week. The purchase closed in August of 1982. Roy paid for it with 22 years of savings and a small mortgage from the Millhaven Savings Bank, which was the kind of community bank that had been in the town since 1891, and that made decisions about loans based on the character of the borrower as much as on the financial metrics, and which had known Roy's work and Roy's reputation in the region for long enough to consider him a reliable risk. The loan officer was a man named Peterson who had gone to school with Roy's older brother and who shook Roy's hand after the signing and said simply, "Take care of it," meaning the land, meaning the property, meaning the opportunity that was now Roy's to make good on. Roy took care of it. He spent the next 14 months evenings and weekends and every day of his 2-week vacation each year renovating the farmhouse. He did not rush. He did not cut corners. He fixed what needed fixing down to the foundation and replaced what needed replacing with materials that would last. And he did it in the right order, which meant addressing structural issues before cosmetic ones and water issues before everything else. Because water, Roy believed, was the fundamental problem with all the old buildings, and everything else was secondary to getting the water right. They moved into the farmhouse in October of 1983. By then, Maggie was pregnant with Danny, who would arrive the following April, and the house was ready for both of them, not finished in the decorative sense, because Roy was not much interested in decoration, but finished in the structural sense, which meant it was dry and sound and warm, and would remain so for as long as anyone who lived in it paid attention to the things that needed attention. The barn was his next project. He had been working on it alongside the house in the time he could spare for more than a year. He had re-roofed it first. That was the water question. That was always the first question, using cedar shakes, that he split himself from a white cedar log he had hauled out of a sawmill's discard pile, because split shakes followed the wood's grain and shed water cleanly and lasted longer than sawn shakes by a factor of decades. The new roof went on in the autumn of 1982, while the farmhouse renovation was still in its early stages, and after it was on, Roy allowed himself a moment of looking at it from the yard before going back to work on the house. The barn looked like a barn again, not like a ruin. That was enough for now. He rebuilt the barn wall by wall through 1983 and into 1984, doing what could be salvaged and replacing what could not, never compromising on the structural elements and compromising carefully on the finish where compromise was acceptable. The original post and beam framing he left almost entirely intact, cleaning it and reinforcing the joinery where needed, and adding 2 replacement posts where the originals had been damaged beyond usefulness. He replaced the board and batten siding, matching the original profile as closely as he could find at a local sawmill that still cut to traditional dimensions. He rebuilt the main doors on hand-forged strap hinges he found at an architectural salvage dealer in Litchfield, because the original hardware had been lost and reproductions would not have had the weight and the character of the real thing. In the autumn of 1984, when he finally stood back and looked at the finished barn, he felt something that was not pride, exactly. Pride was too simple a word for what it was, but was related to pride in the way that a completed thing is related to the intention that preceded it. He had looked at that structure for the first time in the spring of 1982, and he had understood what it needed, and he had done what it needed, and the result was what he had understood it could be. That was satisfying in a way that went deeper than the word satisfaction. Earl Moody came over that October afternoon and stood with Roy in the yard looking at the barn. Earl farmed the property that adjoined the Holloways to the north, 112 acres of mixed pasture and woodlot that had been in his family since his grandfather's time. He was 62 that year, a lean, deliberate man with the specific kind of physical competence that comes from 50 years of doing physical work that required both strength and precision, and the specific kind of social economy that comes from spending most of your life in a place where everyone knows you and you know everyone, and words mean exactly what they say. "She's straight," Earl said, looking at the barn. "Best I could do," Roy said. "That's all she needs to be," Earl said. They stood there for a while longer without speaking because there was nothing else that needed to be said about it. But the barn's reconstruction was not the only thing Roy had been doing that autumn. In November of 1983, while he was still finishing the interior of the farmhouse and beginning the planning for the barn's exterior rehabilitation, Roy had done something else, something quiet and unannounced, something he did not explain to Maggie at the time, and that she would not learn about until after his death more than 35 years later. He had gone to the town hall and filed a lien notice. The filing was numbered 83-D-114 in the town records. It established in the precise language of Connecticut land records that the barn and the 1-acre parcel of land, it stood on a parcel that Roy had surveyed himself and that he had marked as parcel 9C-2 in the property records, were the subject of a workman's lien in Roy's name for labor and materials expended in the rehabilitation of the structure. A line notice by itself would have been unremarkable. Contractors filed them routinely to protect their right to payment. But Roy was not a contractor. In this situation, he was the property owner. What he was doing was something different, something that required a specific knowledge of how property law worked and a specific intention about what he wanted to accomplish. Roy had this knowledge because he had been involved in a situation 6 years earlier when a client had disputed the ownership of improvements Roy had made to a property, claiming that the improvements became part of the property and belonged to the property owner rather than to Roy. Roy had lost that dispute because his documentation had been inadequate. He had not filed in time. He had not been specific enough about what was his and what was the property's. He had never forgotten that loss, not because of the money, which was significant, but not ruinous, but because of what it taught him about the relationship between the record and the truth. The record and the truth were not always the same thing. The truth was what had actually happened. The record was what you could prove. The two could diverge, and when they diverged, the record won because the record was what courts and institutions worked with. The truth existed in your memory and in the memories of the people who had been present, and memory was fallible and mortal and could be disputed. The record existed in the filing cabinet at the town hall in ink on paper, dated and indexed, impermanent. Roy believed in the record. He had always believed in keeping things in order. His tools were organized in a specific way that allowed him to find any tool in the dark. His invoices were filed by date and by client. His receipts were kept in a cigar box sorted by year. But after the dispute with the client, he began to understand the record in a larger sense as a form of self-protection that extended beyond the practical into something that was almost philosophical. What you put into the record mattered. What you failed to put into the record left a gap that other people could fill with their version of events. The lien filing of November 1983 was Roy's way of putting something into the record. What he put in was this: that the barn and the parcel it stood on were not simply part of the farm. They were a specific, inseparable thing with a specific history of labor and investment that was Roy's, and that Roy intended to make permanent in the record before any future confusion could arise about it. He did not explain this to Maggie. He was not a man who explained his thinking about things unless asked, and in this case, the filing felt to him like maintenance, the same category of thing as re-roofing the barn before anything else, addressing the structural vulnerability before it became a crisis. He simply did it and moved on. The spring of 1984 brought Danny into the world 10 days early on a Thursday morning when the mud season had just broken and the first wildflowers were appearing in the pasture along the stone wall, and Roy and Maggie brought him home to the farmhouse and the work of their life together, which was now the work of 3 people rather than 2, and which required no fewer adjustments than Roy had expected and several more than Maggie had expected, and which was good. Roy finished the barn's exterior in the summer of 1984. By then, he had also begun work on what would become over the following years the true project of his life in that place. He had cleared the barn's interior of everything that had accumulated there through decades of disuse, rotted hay, broken equipment, a drift of old lumber that had been stacked against one wall and forgotten. And he had cleaned the original board floor and checked every plank and replaced the ones that needed replacing and left the rest. He had built along the north wall a workbench. It was a substantial piece of work 12 feet long, made from 2-inch thick ash planking that Roy had air-dried himself for 18 months before using so that it would not rack or cup after installation. He built it with a leg vise at the left end and a planing stop along the front edge and a row of drawers along the back drawers that slid on handmade wooden runners because metal hardware was cold in winter, and Roy worked in that barn in the winter. He built it to last. He built it to be the place where he would do his best work for the rest of his life. And he built it as a gift, though he would not have said so and did not need to say so. He built it as a gift to himself, to the practice of making things well to the land and the barn and the life he was building in that place. That is what serious craftsmen do when they build their workshop. They build a place that is adequate to the work they intend to do, and in doing so they make a kind of declaration about what they take seriously. In June of 1985, 18 months after the lien filing, Roy went back to the town hall. He had in the interval prepared the paperwork for the next step. He had worked with a surveyor to formally establish the dimensions of parcel 9C to the 1-acre parcel on which the barn stood, and to record those dimensions against the broader parcel 4A, which was the farm's primary designation in the county land records. He filed a formal deed of separation. The deed, which would be filed as 85-C-441 in the town records, established parcel 9C-2 as a separately deeded piece of land, with the barn and its 1 acre formally recognized as a distinct parcel within the larger property. The deed named Roy Holloway as the owner. It referenced the lien filing 83-D-114 as the originating document establishing Roy's interest in the structure. It described the parcel's boundaries with the specificity that Roy had learned to require in his professional life, because boundary descriptions that were not specific were boundaries that could be disputed. He paid the filing fee $11 in 1985 and received a stamped copy of the deed for his records. He folded the deed carefully the way he folded everything he intended to keep, and he brought it home and put it in the tin lockbox on the high shelf in the barn where he kept the barn's important papers. The original structural assessment he had made when he first walked the property, the cedar shake invoice, the records of the repairs he had made to the framing. He did not tell Maggie about the deed filing either, not because he was hiding anything from her, but because in his mind it was a maintenance task, a piece of administrative work that was simply part of keeping things right, no more remarkable than replacing a roof board that had begun to check. He had addressed a vulnerability. The record was now complete. He moved on to the next thing. Maggie would not discover the deed for 35 years. The years that followed were the years of the life they had made there, and they were good years. Mostly the way that lives built on solid ground and honest work tend to be good, not spectacular, not charmed, not free of difficulty, but fundamentally sound, in the way that a well-built structure is fundamentally sound, able to take what the weather brings and remain standing when it has passed. Roy worked. He took restoration jobs within a reasonable driving radius and was gone some days and home other days. And on the days he was home, he worked in the barn at the workbench on projects of his own choosing. He built furniture mostly, chairs and tables and cabinets and chests, working in whatever wood seemed right for the piece, taking his time because the work was not for sale and did not need to be finished on any schedule, but the schedule the piece itself required. He gave some pieces away, a rocking chair to Maggie's parents in New Hampshire, a blanket chest to Earl and his wife. When their daughter got married, a small cabinet to the Methodist Church for storing the hymnals that were always being left in disarray. He kept some pieces in the house where they gradually replaced the furniture they had moved in with, and the house acquired over time the character of a place where things were used and mattered. Maggie taught. She had given up her classroom job when Danny was born and had done daycare from the house for 5 years while Danny was small, and then she had returned to teaching part-time at the Millhaven Elementary School 3rd grade in 1990 when Danny started kindergarten. She stayed at the school for 22 years, long enough that she eventually taught children of children she had taught in her first round, which was a kind of continuity she had not anticipated, and that pleased her in a way she found hard to articulate. She was good at the work. She was patient and specific, and she believed that what she did mattered, which is the thing that keeps teachers teaching when everything else argues against it. Danny grew up in the farmhouse and in the barn. He was Roy's child in temperament, more than Maggie's, which she recognized without resentment. Quiet, observant, better with things than with words, with the same instinct for how things fit together that Roy had. Only Danny's instinct ran toward mechanical systems rather than wood. By the time he was 10, he could diagnose a problem with an engine by the sound it made, and by the time he was 14, he was rebuilding small motors in a corner of the barn that Roy had ceded to him without ceremony, simply clearing the space and providing the tools and letting Danny work. There was the summer Danny was 12, when he and Roy rebuilt an old tractor together, a 1952 Ford 8N that a neighboring farmer had been storing in a shed for a decade. Roy brought it to the barn and parked it in the center of the floor and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Danny. "Where do we start?" Roy said. Danny thought about it. "Water," Danny said. Roy nodded. That was right. They worked on it through the summer evenings after dinner, the cooling system first, then the fuel system, then the electrical, then the mechanicals, and by September, the tractor started on the second pole and ran cleanly. Danny stood next to it with grease on his forearms and an expression Roy recognized because it was the same expression he saw in his own mirror after a job came out right. Roy put his hand on Danny's shoulder. He did not say anything. Danny understood. These were the years of the tractor, the years of the workbench, the years of the kitchen garden, and the school and the Sunday afternoon drives along the hill roads, when the foliage was at its peak and the light was the particular amber that the Connecticut hills do in October when the conditions are right. These were the years that accumulate in a life and become, in retrospect, the life itself, the substance of it, the thing you are referring to when you say it was a good life. Roy and Maggie did not say this to each other because they were not people who narrated their own lives in that way, but both of them understood it. Danny left for college in the fall of 1996, the University of Connecticut Electrical Engineering, which surprised neither of them. He came home for holidays and for long stretches in summer, and eventually in his mid-20s settled in Virginia, where he worked for a firm that did commercial electrical contracting and where he eventually made a life, a house, a wife, 2 daughters, the specific kind of adulthood that parents hope for and do not take credit for. Roy retired from restoration work in 2008 at 60. Not because the work had diminished or his ability to do it, he was still sharp and still in demand, but because he had saved enough and because the projects he wanted to do were all in that barn, and because he was at an age when the distance between him and the work he most cared about felt worth closing. He worked in the barn every day after that. He was happier than he had been in years, which was saying something because he had not been unhappy before. Maggie retired from teaching in 2012. She took up the kitchen garden in a more serious way and read more and drove into Litchfield occasionally to have lunch with friends she had made over 30 years of living in the region. She and Roy had the farmhouse mostly to themselves, which suited both of them, and they developed the specific domestic rhythm of two people who have spent 40 years learning each other's habits and have arrived through that long study at a state of mutual accommodation that requires no negotiation because both people have long since agreed without needing to say so on what matters and what doesn't. Roy planted a stand of sugar maples along the south edge of the property in 2015, 8 tree saplings from a nursery in Litchfield. He was 67. A sugar maple takes 40 years to reach tapping size. He knew he would not tap these trees. He planted them anyway because the tree line on the south side of the property needed reinforcing, and because the maples would be beautiful in October, and because 40 years from now, someone who lived here would have trees to tap. Maggie had watched him plant them. She had come out to the edge of the pasture where he was working a Sunday afternoon in April, and she had stood at the edge of the soft ground and watched him set each sapling with the same care and deliberateness he brought to everything. When he had finished and was standing back, checking the spacing by eye the way he always did, she said, "You know you won't see those reach full size." Roy had looked at the saplings. He had looked at the ridge beyond them, where the older maples were just beginning to show the first green of the season. He had thought about it for a moment. "Somebody will," he said. Maggie had thought about that sentence for years afterward. It was the most Roy sentence she had ever heard him say, and she had heard him say a great many Roy sentences, and she had collected them over the years without meaning to, without knowing that she was doing it the way you collect things that have value before you understand what value means. The heart attack came in the summer of 2019. Roy was 71. He had been working in the barn that morning, finishing a small cabinet he had been building for the spare bedroom, and Maggie had brought him coffee at 9 o'clock, which was their habit, and he had been at the workbench and had looked up when she came in and said thank you. And that was the last entirely ordinary moment. He collapsed at 10:45 on the barn floor between the workbench and the door. Maggie found him at 11:15 when she came to call him for lunch. She did not panic. She called 911 and she told them what she saw, and she gave them the address, and she answered their questions, and she stayed on the line until the ambulance arrived. And she did all of this in the calm, specific manner of a woman who had spent her career managing situations that required steadiness, regardless of how frightened you were on the inside, and who knew that the most useful thing she could do was the practical thing. He died in the ambulance. There was nothing to be done. The doctor at the hospital in Torrington was kind and specific, which was what she needed, and she thanked him, and she called Danny from the hospital waiting room, and she drove herself home on the familiar roads through the familiar countryside in the early afternoon, and she parked in the familiar gravel parking area in front of the familiar farmhouse. And she got out of the car and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and picked up the coffee cup that was still there from the morning and held it for a while. She did not cry immediately. The tears came later in waves over days and weeks and months, at unexpected moments and at expected ones. She grieved in the way that serious people grieve, thoroughly and without performance, feeling what she felt when she felt it and doing what needed to be done, regardless of how she felt, and giving herself time, because time was the only thing that was actually useful, and she had learned long ago not to rush it. Danny came for the funeral and stayed for 2 weeks. He helped with the practical things and sat with her in the evenings, and they talked about Roy, which was what they needed to do, and they did it. He offered to stay longer. She thanked him and told him to go home to his family. She was alone in the farmhouse through the winter of 2019 and the spring of 2020 and the difficult pandemic summer when she could not travel and Danny could not come. She tended the garden and she read and she walked the property in the evenings when the light was good. She walked out to the barn most evenings and she stood inside it in the failing light, and she let herself be there with Roy's tools on their pegs and Roy's workbench along the north wall, and the smell of wood and linseed oil that had accumulated in the structure over 35 years of his work. She did not do anything in the barn. She stood in it. That was enough. She was 68 years old, a widow on a 32-acre property with a farmhouse and a barn that needed maintenance, and 30 years of accumulated living and a mortgage that Roy had almost paid off, which she now paid alone on a teacher's retirement income and a small Social Security benefit. She managed. She was not reckless and she was not careless, and she knew how to manage, but she also knew that managing was not the same as comfortable and that the margin between them was thin enough to require attention. The property taxes on the farm had been increasing for years as the county assessor's office updated its valuations to reflect the rising value of rural Connecticut land, which had been discovered by people from cities who wanted the thing that rural Connecticut had always had, but had not always been expensive to have. By the summer of 2021, Maggie was having conversations with herself that were harder than the conversations she had with anyone else about the farm, and what she owed it, and what she owed herself, and whether the two things could both be honored at the same time. The bank, it was no longer the Millhaven Savings Bank, which had been acquired by a regional institution in 2003, which had been acquired by a larger institution in 2011, began sending letters in the fall of 2022. The letters were correct and professional in tone and described the situation accurately. The mortgage payments had fallen behind. The arrears were accumulating. The institution was required by its procedures to notify her of the possible outcomes. She read each letter carefully, and set it in the folder she kept for correspondence of this kind, and thought about what she could do and did what she could do, and wrote to them explaining her situation, which they acknowledged. By the spring of 2023, the formal foreclosure proceedings had begun. By the autumn of 2024, the property had been scheduled for auction. She told Danny on a Sunday phone call in October. She had waited until she was certain about the situation and certain about what she was going to do before she told him, because she had not wanted to alarm him before she knew what she was doing. Danny was alarmed anyway, which was the appropriate response. He wanted to come up immediately. She told him to wait. He asked what she was planning. She said she was working on it. She spent the next 6 weeks working on it. What she was working on was in the barn. She had known in a general way that the lockbox existed. Roy had mentioned it once in a practical context. The way he mentioned all the organizational systems of the farm. The box was on the high shelf above the tool cabinet. It had a key. The key was on a hook behind the main barn door. It contained the barn's important papers. She had not thought much about this at the time because there was no reason to think about it. The barn was Roy's domain in a way that was not exclusionary but was simply accurate. He ran it, he maintained it, he knew where everything was and why. She had trusted that and had not needed to verify it in the same way she had trusted the structure of the barn itself without knowing precisely how every joint was cut. She went to the barn on a Tuesday morning in mid-November of 2024, 3.5 months before the auction that was now scheduled for February. It was cold but clear, the kind of November morning in the Connecticut hills where the light has the crystalline quality of very cold air and everything looks more detailed than usual. The stone walls and the bare trees and the ridge to the east showing every branch against the pale sky. She let herself into the barn and stood for a moment inside the door, the way she always did, letting the smell and the quiet settle around her. The barn smelled of itself, dry wood and old iron, and the faint residue of linseed oil, and the cold, clean smell of a space that had good ventilation and no moisture problems. Roy had built that into it. The ventilation was one of the first things he had addressed in the rehabilitation. The original louvers in the gable ends had been closed up at some point in the building's history, probably by someone who thought they were keeping the cold out. But what they had actually accomplished was trapping the moisture that led to rot and mold and the slow deterioration of the structure from the inside. Roy had restored the original ventilation pattern and added 2 more louver openings, and the barn had breathed properly ever since. She went to the door behind the workbench and found the key on the hook where Roy had said it would be, a small brass key on a piece of wire hanging on a nail that Roy had driven into a specific spot in the doorframe that she recognized as his kind of solution to a storage problem: simple, direct, unmistakable. The lockbox was where he had said it would be. It was a standard tin deed box, the kind sold at hardware stores and office supply shops throughout the 20th century for exactly this purpose: storing papers that needed to be kept flat and dry and secure. It was dark green with a small brass lock, and the finish was slightly worn at the corners from years of handling. She lifted it down from the shelf and carried it to the workbench and set it in the light that came through the east-facing windows, the morning light, which was the best light in the barn. She opened it with the key. Inside, folded with the precision she had expected, Roy's folding was as distinctive as his handwriting, precise and consistent, and done the same way every time, were several documents. She lifted them out one by one. The first was the original structural assessment Roy had made in 1982, handwritten on the yellow legal pad paper that he had used for field notes, with measurements and observations written in his block letter printing, neat and legible. She read through it, and she recognized his voice in it, the specific attention to what was sound and what needed work, the unsentimental assessment, the ordered list of priorities. It made her chest tight in the way that familiar things make your chest tight when the person who made them is gone. The second was the contractor's invoice from the Cedar Shake supplier in 1982. The third was a surveyor's report from 1984. The fourth was a document she did not immediately recognize. It was typed, not handwritten, on paper that had aged to a warm ivory. The folds were deep and regular, the kind that form when a document has been folded the same way and kept in the same position for a very long time. She unfolded it carefully because the paper felt fragile at the creases, and she spread it on the surface of the workbench in the morning light and read it. It was a deed. The heading read, Deed of Separate Parcel 9-2 Millhaven Township, Litchfield County, State of Connecticut. Below the heading was the formal legal language of a property deed, the description of the parcel, its dimensions and boundaries, its relationship to the parent parcel. 4. A, the name of the owner, Roy James Holloway. At the bottom, the date, June 14th, 1985. A stamp from the town clerk's office. A filing number, 85-C-441. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She stood at Roy's workbench with the deed in her hands, in the morning light coming through the east windows, in the cold quiet of the barn around her, and she understood what she was looking at. She understood it not in legal terms, she would need help with the legal terms, but in Roy terms, which was the kind of understanding that mattered first. He had done this in 1985. He had filed a lien notice in 1983 and followed it with a formal deed in 1985, and he had said nothing about it in all the years between then and the February morning in 2019 when he died on this floor. He had filed the papers and put them in the lockbox and put the lockbox on the shelf and gone back to work. Why she thought about it? She thought about Roy and about how he thought about things and about what he had valued and how he had protected what he valued. He had not been a secretive man. He had not withheld things from her. But he had not always felt the need to explain his preventive measures, the things he did because they needed doing, regardless of whether a crisis was visible on the horizon. He had re-roofed the barn before anything else. He had addressed the ventilation before the aesthetics. He had fixed the water first. He had looked ahead to the vulnerabilities and addressed them without drama. And when the drama never came, as it usually didn't, the work looked like nothing because the crisis it had prevented never happened. She folded the deed carefully the way Roy had folded it, matching the existing crease lines with her fingertips. She put it back in the lockbox. She put the lockbox on the workbench where she could see it, and she sat down on the low stool that Roy had always kept beside the workbench for exactly this purpose, for sitting and thinking, and she thought. The barn was on Parcel 9C2. The deed for Parcel 9C2 was in Roy's name, separately recorded. The bank's foreclosure had been filed against Parcel 4A, which was the farm. If Parcel 9C2 had been properly separated from Parcel 4A in the records, then the barn was not part of the foreclosure. She did not know if the separation had been done correctly. She did not know if it had been maintained over the decades in the county records. She did not know if a deed filed in 1985 was still valid and clear and findable. She did not know what challenges a lawyer like Caldwell or whoever represented the bank would raise against it. She knew one person who might be able to help her find out. Her name was Eleanor Pruitt, and she worked at the Litchfield County Land Records Office, and she had been Maggie's student at Millhaven Elementary in the spring of 1995 when she was a slight, serious 9-year-old who had a gift for organized thinking and a habit of asking questions that were more precise than the questions most 9-year-olds asked. She was 40 now and had worked in the Land Records Office for 15 years and was by reputation and by Maggie's own quiet observation good at her job. Maggie drove to Litchfield the following Thursday. She brought the deed in the lockbox because she did not want to risk damaging it and because arriving with the original document seemed more appropriate than arriving with a copy. She had called ahead and Eleanor had said, "Come in the morning when it's quiet." Maggie had come in the morning. Eleanor looked at the deed for a long time. She did not speak while she was reading it, and Maggie waited sitting in the chair across the desk from Eleanor's chair, in the small office that smelled of old paper and fluorescent lights, the specific smell of a place where documents are kept and cared for and referred to by people who believe in the record. "This is filed," Eleanor said finally. "Filing 85-C-441. I can cross-reference it in the index." She looked up at Maggie. "You have the lien notice too." "I found a reference to it in the deed," Maggie said. 83-D-114. Eleanor turned to her computer. Her fingers moved on the keyboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who has navigated a particular database for years and knows where everything is without needing to think about it. "I have the lien filing," she said. "November 1983, and the deed cross-references it correctly." She scrolled. "The deed of separation, June 1985. It's in the record. It has never been vacated." "Was it included in any of the subsequent filings on Parcel 4A?" Maggie asked. She had prepared this question. She had thought about what she needed to know. Eleanor scrolled through more records. She moved carefully, checking each entry the way a person moves through records when they know that the details matter and that a wrong answer would be worse than no answer. "No," she said. The deed for 9-2 is not referenced in any subsequent filings against 4-A. The foreclosure filing against 4-A she's checked doesn't reference 9C-2 at all. The bank filed against the primary parcel. They may not have known about the subdivision. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Is there a way they should have known? Eleanor looked at her with the direct, unsentimental attention that Maggie remembered from when Eleanor was 9 years old and had a question she actually wanted answered. The records are indexed by parcel number, Eleanor said. If you run a search on parcel 4A, you get the main parcel. You'd have to know to look for a subdivision, or you'd have to do a broader search of all parcels with the same owner of record. They probably didn't do that. It's not uncommon. Maggie nodded slowly. She looked at the deed in its lockbox. What would I need to do, she said, to use this at the auction? Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair. She was not a lawyer and she was careful about the boundary, but she was a person who knew what the records said and could explain what the records meant. You'd want a certified copy of the deed, she said, and of the lien filing, both on file here, both certifiable. And you'd want to understand the argument you're making, which is that the parcel was properly separated before the foreclosure, that the separation is in the record, and that the barn is therefore not subject to the foreclosure instrument. And if someone argues against it, they can argue, the record says what it says. Filing 85-C-441, it's in the index. It's been in the index since June of 1985. Eleanor paused. Your husband did this very carefully, Mrs. Holloway. The cross-referencing is correct. The surveyor's description of the parcel boundaries is specific. He knew what he was doing when he filed this. Maggie looked at the deed. Yes, she said, he did. She drove home with a certified copy of both documents in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, and she thought about Roy all the way home, and she thought about the workbench and the morning light and the stool he had kept for thinking, and she thought about the years they had lived in that place and the things he had done and the things he had not said. She thought about the maple trees on the south edge of the property, which were 7 years old now, and which had survived their first winters and their first dry summers, and which were, by Roy's calculation, 33 years from tapping size. She thought about somebody, Will. She drove carefully on the familiar roads, and she did not cry until she was back in the driveway, and even then it was only briefly the short, specific grief of a person who has discovered that someone they loved had thought ahead on their behalf, had prepared something for them that they did not know they would need, had done the quiet work of protection in a language that required no explanation, because the work itself was the explanation. Then she dried her eyes and went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and began to prepare what she would say at the auction. She did not prepare a speech. She had no gift for speeches and no interest in them. What she prepared was an argument, clear-ordered, specific, and she prepared it the way Roy had always prepared for difficult jobs, which was by knowing exactly what she was working with and what each piece of it was for. She knew what the deed said. She knew what the lien filing said. She knew what the filing numbers were, both of them, and she could recite them without looking at the documents because she had read them enough times that they had become as familiar as her own address. She knew the parcel number 9C2 and the parent parcel 4A and the date of the deed June 14th, 1985, and the date of the lien November 1983. She also called Danny. She told him what she had found and what she intended to do. Danny was quiet for a longer time than usual, which was the way Danny processed things that surprised him by going silent and thinking before he spoke. Is this going to hold up? He said. The records are clear, she said. Eleanor went through them. The deed is in the index. It's never been vacated. It's specific about the parcel boundaries. But a lawyer like Caldwell works with the record, she said. The record says what it says. Another pause. Mom, Danny said. I know, she said. I know what I'm doing. She heard him breathe. She knew what he wanted to say, that she should not go alone, that he should come, that this was too important for her to handle by herself. She also knew what he would understand if she let him get there, that this was her thing to do. It was the land she had lived on for 41 years. It was the barn Roy had built. It was her husband's voice in the record speaking from 1985, saying what he had prepared for this moment, and she was the one who needed to be there to let him say it. I'll call you after, she said. She arrived at the community hall 30 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin. She wanted to see the room before it filled to know where everything was. This was a habit from teaching. She always arrived early enough to see the space empty before the students came in because the empty space told you things about the day that the full space did not. She saw the folding table at the front. She saw the leather portfolio and the blue rubber-banded stack of papers. She saw the chairs being set out by a young man who worked at the town hall and who nodded to her when she came in. She sat in a chair at the back of the room on the right side where she could see both the front table and the door. She put her handbag on her lap and the manila envelope on top of the handbag, and she sat with her hands folded and she waited. The envelope had the certified copies in it. The original deed returned from Eleanor's office after certification was in the lockbox in the barn. She had decided that the certified copies were what she needed for today, and that the original was safest where it was in the dry and the dark of Roy's high shelf. The room filled slowly. She recognized most of the faces: Earl Moody coming in with his habitual deliberateness and taking a seat in the third row on the left, looking around the room with the particular expression of a man who has been present at too many of these occasions and who has something specific to say about this one, though it is not yet time to say it. Walt Greer, the county sheriff who was 68 and had known Roy from decades of neighboring, taking a seat in the back row across the aisle from Maggie and giving her a nod that meant several things at once. Several people she recognized from the Methodist Church. Several she did not recognize, strangers drawn by the auction notice men with clipboards, or with the speculative attentiveness of people who attend auctions looking for opportunity. Caldwell arrived at 20 minutes to 11. He came in with the brisk, purposeful gait of a man who had planned to be in this room for exactly the time the proceedings required and intended to leave on schedule. He was perhaps 55, well-dressed in the conservative manner of a Boston attorney carrying his leather portfolio and a briefcase that he set on the floor beside the folding table. He arranged his papers with practiced efficiency. He did not look around the room with curiosity. He had attended enough proceedings like this one that the room held nothing for him beyond its functional dimensions. Brent Sauer came in shortly after, sat in the second row, and opened a folder on his knee that appeared to contain architectural sketches. He studied them with the focused attention of a man mentally measuring a thing he expects in the next 30 minutes to have confirmed as his. The auction proceeded through its formal opening. The county clerk's representative read the legal description of the property. The bid history was confirmed. The final bid, Sauer's $41,000, was acknowledged as the highest in final bid received. Caldwell began arranging the transfer documents, and Maggie stood up. Or rather, she did not stand immediately because she had decided not to stand dramatically. She waited until the specific moment when Caldwell reached for the documents to begin the final signing. She waited for the moment when the room's attention was on the table, when the proceedings had the feeling of conclusion, when a voice from the back would be maximally heard because it was maximally unexpected. She stood. "Stop the filing," she said. The room went still in the way that rooms go still when something unexpected happens. Not silence exactly, because silence is the absence of sound, but something more active than silence. The collective withdrawal of breath and motion, the contraction of attention toward a single point. Caldwell looked up. His expression arranged itself into the patient, authoritative look of a man who has encountered this before. Maggie walked forward. She had thought in the weeks of preparation about this walk. She had thought about what it meant to walk forward in that room toward that table, toward a man who had every legal and professional expectation of getting his way. She had thought about what it would feel like. She did not feel as she walked the way she had expected to feel. She had expected some version of fear, or at least of nervousness, the particular nervous energy of a person about to do something that might not work. What she felt instead was clarity. She had her documents. She had the record. The record said what it said. She was simply the person who had come to say it aloud, and there was nothing frightening about saying the truth aloud in front of people who needed to hear it. She reached the table. She placed the certified copy of the deed on the surface. "Filing 83-D-114, she said, "established a lien in November of 1983 for the barn structure on the Holloway property. Filing 85-C-441, dated June of 1985, established parcel 9C-2 as a separately deeded parcel with the barn as its primary structure. The deed names Roy James Holloway as the owner of record. Parcel 9C2 was never included in any subsequent filing against Parcel 4A. The foreclosure instrument filed against Parcel 4A does not and cannot encumber parcel 9C2. She paused. She let the room have the words. The barn, she said, is not part of this sale. Caldwell's expression did not change visibly, but something in it shifted in a way that she recognized the slight recalibration of a man who has encountered something he was not expecting and who is now determining how to respond to it. He looked at the document. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it from above, reading what he could read from that angle. "Ma'am," he said, and the professional patience in his voice was genuine, but there was something behind it now that had not been there before. "A lien notice from 1983 does not constitute a separate deed. This property was sold as a unified parcel." "Not a lien notice," Maggie said. "A deed of separation, filing 85-C-441. You'll find it in the Litchfield County Land Records indexed under Parcel 9C-2. That is a certified copy. I have the original." Caldwell picked up the document. He read it. He read it again. She watched him read it, and she thought about Roy at the workbench, about the way he read a piece of wood before cutting it, the same focused attention, the same refusal to move, until he understood exactly what he was working with. "This was filed in 1985, Caldwell said. 39 years ago, Maggie said. "It has been in the county index for 39 years. A deed from 1985 may have been superseded. There is a certification from the county records office." She took the second document from the envelope. "This certifies that filing 85-C-441 has never been vacated, challenged, or superseded. It is current as of last Thursday." A low sound moved through the room. Not loud, not the kind of sound that rooms make in movies when something dramatic happens. It was quieter than that and more genuine, a collective exhale, the kind that comes when people who have been holding themselves tense begin cautiously to breathe. Earl Moody in the third row was watching Maggie with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man who was allowing himself to feel something he had been careful not to feel before it was warranted. Caldwell was reading the certification. "I'll need to verify this independently," he said. "Of course," Maggie said. She said it with the unruffled equanimity of a woman who expected this response and had no objection to it because she knew what the verification would find. "The filing number is 85-C-441, the county records office in Litchfield. Eleanor Pruitt can assist you. She already reviewed these documents in full. You're welcome to call her now." A pause. Caldwell looked at the document. He looked at Maggie. He looked at the document again. He turned to Sauer. Brent Sauer had set his folder of architectural sketches on the seat beside him. He was watching Caldwell with the careful attention of a man who is making a real-time assessment of a situation that has not gone the way he expected it to go. "Brent," Caldwell said, dropping the formality of the room, "I need a few minutes." Sauer nodded. He was a practical man. He understood when a situation required reassessment. Caldwell took the documents to the side of the room near the narrow window, and he made a phone call. Maggie watched him from her position at the table. She did not try to hear what he was saying. She did not need to. She looked at the room instead, at Earl, who had settled back in his chair with a look of patient waiting, at Walt Greer, who was sitting with his hands on his knees and his eyes on Caldwell, at the neighbors and the strangers who were sitting in the folding chairs and watching and understanding that they were present at something that would be talked about in this town for a while. Caldwell came back to the table. He stood for a moment. He was arranging something in himself. She could see it, the small internal adjustment of a man who is preparing to say something he did not come here to say. "The deed filing appears to be valid," he said. "Not the deed is valid, appears to be." He was a lawyer and he preserved his options even now. "Yes," Maggie said. "The auction cannot proceed until the question of parcel boundaries is resolved." "That is correct," Maggie said. Another adjustment. "The resolution would likely involve a title search against the deed and a formal determination by the county of the current status of parcel 9C-2 relative to parcel 4-A. I believe the records are sufficient for that determination to be made quickly," Maggie said. He looked at her for a moment. It was a different kind of looking than before, without the professional patience, without the authority. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you are not sure what you are seeing. "Where did this come from?" he said. It was not a legal question. It was a genuine one. "My husband filed it in 1985, she said. He was a careful man. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "Clearly," he said. He turned to the room. He announced in the formal language of his profession that the proceedings were being suspended pending resolution of a title question and that all parties would be notified of the rescheduled date. Brent Sauer's bid remained active, but the transfer was not complete. The auction was for the time being over. The room exhaled collectively. People began to stand the careful movement of people who are not sure yet what to feel. Several people were looking at Maggie, not with the kind of attention that makes you self-conscious, but with something warmer than that, a recognition, the specific look that communities give to one of their own when one of their own has done something that the community had been quietly hoping someone would do. Earl Moody was already on his feet. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows exactly where he is going. He stopped in front of Maggie. He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at her with the same directness he had always brought to looking at things that mattered. Roy would have been matter-of-fact about it, he said. He was, Maggie said. Earl nodded slowly. Filed it in '85, he said. I was there when he surveyed that corner of the parcel. June, I think, early summer. He didn't say much about why he was doing it. He never said much about why, Maggie said. Earl almost smiled. No, he said. He didn't. Walt Greer found her near the door as she was preparing to leave. He was a large man who had always carried his size with the careful economy of someone who had learned young. That size could be alarming if not managed thoughtfully, and he moved the same way now at 68 as he had at 40 steadily, without hurry, with a habitual consideration of the space he occupied. You want me to drive behind you, he said. It was the kind of offer that had nothing to do with whether she needed a police escort and everything to do with the fact that he was Roy's neighbor and Roy was gone, and this was what you did. I'm fine, Walt, she said, but thank you. He nodded. Call me if you need anything. He paused. That was well done, Maggie. She thanked him again and walked out into the November morning, which was still clear and cold and precise. The light still crystalline and specific, the bare tree line along the road showing every branch against the pale sky. She walked to her car, and she sat in it for a moment with her hands on the wheel before starting the engine. The proceedings were suspended. The title question would be resolved. She was certain of that because the record was clear, and because Eleanor Pruitt knew the record and would confirm it to anyone who asked, as she had already confirmed it to Maggie, and as she apparently had just confirmed it to Caldwell on his phone call. The formal determination would take some weeks because institutions worked at the pace of institutions, but the outcome was not in doubt. The barn was Roy's. The deed said so. The record said so. It had always been so. She drove home on the familiar roads through the hill country, past the stone walls, and the bare-limbed trees and the fields that had been farmed, and then not farmed, and then farmed again, and that were in their November state gray and brown and honest stripped of everything seasonal, showing only their actual form. She drove past Earl's driveway and waved at the empty driveway from habit, and she drove past the stand of maples on the south edge of her own property, and she looked at them as she turned in the 7-year-old maples in their November state spindly and spare and entirely incorrectly themselves. She parked and went inside and made coffee, and she called Danny. It worked, she said. A long pause, then tell me everything. She told him. She told him from the beginning, the walk to the table, the placement of the document, the filing numbers, Caldwell's response, the phone call, the suspension of proceedings. She told it plainly and in order the way she told things without embellishment and without false modesty, because it had happened the way it had happened, and that was what there was to say about it. Danny was quiet for a moment at the end. Dad filed that in 1985, he said. June of 1985, as she said, before you were a year old. She heard him swallow. He never said anything. No, she said. He just did it. He always just did the thing, she said. That's what he did. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it, and he didn't make a production of it. He's been waiting 40 years to save the barn, Danny said. She thought about that. It was not quite how Roy would have framed it. Roy would have said that he had simply kept the records in order, which was what you did, and that the records had done what records do when they are kept properly. But in another way, in the truer way that was underneath the practical way, Danny was right. Roy had planted something in 1985 the same way he had planted the maples in 2015, something that would be needed later, something that he himself might not see the full benefit of, but that he had done anyway because the future was real, and what you put into the record endured. Yes, she said, I suppose he was. She was quiet for a moment. I found something else, she said. She had not planned to tell him this yet, but it was time. There's an inscription under the workbench, she said, on the underside of the front apron board. I found it last week when I was cleaning the workbench. I think he carved it when he built the bench. What does it say? She looked at the kitchen window. The barn was a dark shape against the afternoon light. She could picture the inscription exactly because she had looked at it for a long time when she found it carved with a narrow chisel into the wood with Roy's characteristic precision, the letters small and clean and permanent. It says Danny Holloway, age 8, first flat tire, June 14th, 1986. The silence on the phone was the silence of someone who has just been given something unexpected and is finding where to put it. June 14th, Danny said finally. That's the same day as the deed. A year apart, she said, the same day. He liked certain dates. I remember that tire, Danny said. His voice had changed slightly, gone quieter, the way voices go, when the thing being discussed is happening in two places at once, in the present moment and in a memory that is very clear. We were coming home from Granddad's. Hit a nail on the back road. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just showed me where everything was in the truck and talked me through each step. He never made a big deal of the things that mattered most, Maggie said. No, Danny said, he never did. They were quiet together on the phone for a moment, which was something they could do, a mother and a grown son who had learned to be easy in silence because they had both spent their lives with a man for whom silence was a natural state. I'm coming up, Danny said, not because you need me, because I want to be there. I know, she said. Come for Thanksgiving. Bring the girls. He came the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, driving up from Virginia, and arriving in the late afternoon when the farmhouse windows were lit from inside the warm light in the cold landscape that is the specific visual warmth of home in November. He came in through the back door the way the family always came in, and he set his bag down in the kitchen and hugged Maggie the way grown children hug their parents fully, with the ease of people who have never really been apart. Show me the barn, he said. She had known he would say this first. She had expected it, and she had been glad that she expected it. They walked out together in the last of the afternoon light across the yard, through the gate in the fence along the path that Roy had laid from flat stones sourced from the property's own fields in the summer of 1987. She opened the barn door and they went in. Danny stopped just inside the way she always stopped, letting the space come to him rather than moving through it immediately. He looked at the post and beam framing the old white oak and chestnut that Roy had preserved and cleaned and reinforced 40 years ago. He looked at the board floor worn smooth and dark from decades of use. He looked at the east windows through which the last of the afternoon light was coming in low and amber. He looked at the workbench along the north wall, 12 feet of ash planking level and true. He went to the workbench and he crouched down and he looked underneath it at the underside of the front apron board. Maggie stood behind him and watched him read it. She watched him read it again. She watched him put his hand up and trace the letters with his fingertip carefully, the way you touch something that is both fragile and permanent. He stayed crouched there for a moment. Then he stood up, and he stood with his hand on the top of the workbench, palm flat on the ash surface, in the way that you stand when you need a moment and you are getting it. He was 45 years old, Maggie said, the year I found the deed. He filed that deed when he was 37. He built this workbench when you were 8 months old and carved that when you were a year old and learned about flat tires. Danny nodded slowly. He was looking down the length of the workbench. He built all of this for us, Danny said. He built it for the work, Maggie said. But the work was for us. She meant this is the distinction Roy would have made, and it was an important one. He had not built the workbench as a gift to Danny or a gift to her. He had built it as the right piece of work to do in this place for this purpose, and the rightness of it, the honesty of the execution, the quality of the materials, and the care of the joinery, that was the gift, the thing itself, not the gesture, but the object, not the intention, but the result. Danny understood this. He had grown up in proximity to Roy long enough to understand the distinction. They stood at the workbench for a while. The barn was quiet and cold. The light was going. Through the east windows, the sky was darkening from the pale transparency of late afternoon toward the richer blue of early evening, and the stone wall along the east field was losing its detail to the shadow. A bird called once from the woodlot on the north end of the property, a late-staying robin, she thought, or something she didn't know by sound, and was silent. Danny reached up and turned on the single overhead light, the bare bulb in a tin shade that Roy had installed in 1988, and that Maggie had never replaced because there was nothing wrong with it, and replacing it would have been changing something that was right. The barn in that light, the bare bulb, the old wood, the workbench, with its shadows, the tools on their pegs along the south wall, looked the way it had always looked, which was the way Roy had made it look, which was the way it should look, which was exactly itself. They went back to the house, and Maggie made dinner, the same dinner she made every year for the first night of Danny's visits. Pot roast with root vegetables from the cellar bread she had baked that morning. The particular combination that had been the homecoming meal since Danny was old enough to have a preference and had established this as his preference, and then never needed to change it because nothing had come along that was better. They sat at Roy's oak table in the kitchen, the table Roy had built from the salvage yard slabs in the fall of their second year, fitted with wooden pegs, finished with linseed oil, and they ate and they talked. They talked about Danny's girls, who were 11 and 8, who were doing the specific things that 11-year-olds and 8-year-olds do, which Danny reported with the particular mixture of pride and bemusement that good parents bring to the ongoing project of their children's development. The 11-year-old had decided she wanted to be an architect. The 8-year-old had decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, which she had been decided about for 7 months and showed no sign of revising. Roy would have approved of both, Maggie said. He would have asked them to show him what they were working on, Danny said, and then he would have sat there for an hour saying almost nothing while they showed him. And they would have felt understood, she said. Yes, Danny said, they would have. This was a thing about Roy that they had discovered only after his death, in the way you discover certain things about a person. Only after they are gone, he had the rare ability to make people feel understood without saying much, purely through the quality of his attention. He paid children the same attention he paid to a piece of wood he was assessing fully without the adult habit of listening with half a mind. He listened to what they actually said and responded to what they had actually said, which was often different from what adults assumed they meant. A friend of Danny's from high school, a boy named Marcus, who had come to the farm several times, had said once, "Your dad actually hears what you say." Danny had not known what to do with this at the time, except feel it. He understood it better now. After dinner, Danny did the dishes, which had been his job since he was tall enough to reach the sink comfortably, and Maggie sat at the table with her coffee and watched him work. This was comfortable, the specific comfort of familiar people doing familiar things in a space they both knew well. The kitchen was warm. The November dark outside the window was complete, the yard invisible, except for the faint pale shape of the barn against the darker mass of the ridge. "What happens next?" Danny said. He was drying a plate, his back to her, but she could hear in his voice that the question was the serious one, the one that had been waiting under the evening's other talk. "The title determination takes about 6 weeks, she said. Eleanor thinks. There may be some additional documentation required from the county assessor's office establishing the current delineation of the 2 parcels. Once that's done, the foreclosure against parcel 4A can be resolved without the barn." "Without the barn," Danny repeated. She paused. "I still have the mortgage," she said. "The foreclosure itself, I still have to deal with that. The barn being separate doesn't resolve the primary debt." Danny turned. He was looking at her with the directness that was one of the things he had taken from Roy, the quality of looking at a thing as it actually was, rather than as you wished it to be. "I've been thinking about that," he said. She waited. "What if we turn the barn into something," he said. "Not selling anything, not changing what it is, but using it. There are farms up here doing craft workshops, woodworking classes, maker spaces. A barn like that with Roy's workbench, with the tools, with the history." He paused. "People pay for access to spaces like that." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know it's not." "No," she said. "Keep going." He kept going. He had thought about it on the drive up, he said. He knew a man in Virginia who had done something similar with a family property, turned a historic outbuilding into a workshop space for hire, and the income from weekend classes and monthly memberships had covered the property taxes with something left over. The key was the integrity of the space people paid for the real thing, not for a reproduction. Roy's barn with Roy's workbench, with the post and beam framing, and the ash planking, and the tools that had been used in that space for 30 years, was as real as a thing could be. She thought about it. She thought about strangers using Roy's workbench, which was the first objection her mind produced. She let that objection sit for a moment, examining it. It was a sentimental objection. Roy had not built that workbench to be preserved as a memorial. He had built it to be used. A workbench that was used was a living workbench. A workbench that was closed off and kept as a monument was just furniture. Roy would not have wanted a monument. She thought about the tools on their pegs. She thought about the planing stop and the leg vise and the drawers with the wooden runners. She thought about what it would mean for someone who had never worked in a proper shop to come into that barn on a Saturday morning and stand at that bench for the first time and understand from the thing itself what it meant to have a space built for the work. Roy would have thought it was a reasonable use of the space, she said. Danny looked at her for a moment. Is that a yes, he said. It's a let's think about it carefully, she said, which is what Roy would have said. Danny smiled. It was Roy's smile, brief and specific. He stayed for 10 days. He spent mornings in the barn, not for any agenda, but because the barn was where he needed to be. He inspected everything with the methodical attention of an electrician who thinks in terms of systems, what was working, what needed attention, what was near the end of its useful life and would need replacement in the next few years. He made notes. He did not hurry. He replaced 2 boards in the floor that had developed slight softness near the wall, catching them before they became a real problem. He rehung the main door on the south wall, which had developed a slight line in the lower hinge over the previous winter, adjusting the hardware with the careful minimalism of someone who understood that a door that was right did not need to be made better, only brought back to right. He oiled every tool on the south wall pegs using the same linseed oil. Roy had always used applied with a cloth folded, the way Roy had always folded it into thirds, then into thirds again, so that you always had a clean surface available by refolding, working down the wall methodically, each tool in its proper place. It was maintenance. It was also something else. He did not name what else it was. He just did it. On the 4th day, Earl Moody appeared in the barn doorway while Danny was at the workbench inspecting the leg vise mechanism, which was smooth, but could benefit from cleaning. I heard you were here, Earl said. Danny straightened and they shook hands. Earl was 82 now, still upright, still lean, still moving with the economy of a man who had managed his body as carefully as he managed his land, which was to say, with full attention to what was structurally necessary and what was merely optional. His eyes were the same direct, clear, not in a hurry. How's the farm, Danny said. Sold the North 40 last spring, Earl said. Kept the rest. House and shop and woodlots enough for me now. Danny nodded. Earl looked around the barn, slowly taking it in. He looked at the framing, at the floor, at the windows, at the workbench. Your father built this bench from 2-inch ash, he said. He air-dried the lumber himself. Took 18 months. I asked him why he didn't just buy dry lumber, and he said because if he bought it, he didn't know for sure it was dry. Danny smiled. That sounds right. He was particular, Earl said. He said it as the highest compliment. He was, Danny said. Earl walked to the bench and ran his hand along the top surface, the same gesture Danny had made. Maggie had made it. The surface had been made for this, for hands to move along it and understand through touch what the eye had confirmed that the work was right and the material was honest and the piece had been built to last. He told me once, Earl said, when they were framing the addition on my south shed, he told me the only way to guarantee a thing would last was to build it, so that the people who came after you would not want to change it because it was already right. Earl's hand moved on the bench. He built a lot of things that nobody ever wanted to change. Danny was quiet for a moment. He did, he said. Earl turned and looked at him with the directness that old men who have earned their years bring to looking at young men who are still sorting theirs out. You're thinking about what to do with it, Earl said. It was not a question. My mother and I have been talking, Danny said. The barn's the point, Earl said. Whatever you do, the barn's the point. Not as a relic, as a working place. That's what Roy built it to be. Danny nodded slowly. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the post and beam framing above him, the old white oak and chestnut that Roy had cleaned and reinforced and preserved, and that was still 40 years later exactly what Roy had understood it to be sound. I know, Danny said. Earl stayed for coffee. He and Maggie sat at Roy's oak table in the kitchen, and they talked about Roy and about the foreclosure and about the deed and about the filing numbers that Maggie recited from memory, 83-D-114 and 85-C-441, the way you recite the numbers of things that matter. Earl listened and asked specific questions and nodded at specific answers and made the kind of comments that come from a man who had known Roy Holloway for 40 years and who understood from that vantage point exactly what the filing of those documents meant. He knew something would happen someday, Earl said. He didn't know what, He didn't need to know what. He just made sure the record was right. Yes, Maggie said. That's how Roy operated, Earl said. You didn't need to know what he'd done until you needed to know. And then it was there. He drove back to his farm in the late afternoon the way he always had, the way neighbors drive back at the end of a visit slowly on roads they know, in the way that you know things you have traveled for 50 years without needing to think about where you are going because the roads themselves think for you. Thanksgiving was the way. Thanksgiving had always been the meal, the table, the conversation, the particular domesticity of a holiday that is at its core about sitting in a specific place with specific people and being aware that you are doing so. Danny's wife, Carol, had come up with the girls, the 11-year-old, whose name was Ruth, and who moved through the farmhouse with a careful attentiveness to its details, asking questions about what things were and how old they were and whether they had always been in that place. The 8-year-old, whose name was May, and who discovered the kitchen garden and spent an hour in the cold November afternoon examining the structures of the spent plants with the focused interest of someone who intends to remember what she is seeing. Ruth had found Roy's woodworking books in the small bookcase in the living room. There were 11 of them, dog-eared and annotated in Roy's block letter printing, going back to editions from the 1970s, and she had asked to take one back to her room to look at. Maggie had said yes, take any you like. Ruth had chosen the one about Japanese hand tools, which was the most worn of the 11 and which had the most annotations in Roy's handwriting, which meant it was the one he had read most carefully and most often. May had asked at dinner whether the sugar maples on the south edge of the property would ever be tapped. Danny had looked at Maggie. Maggie had explained simply that they needed about 30 more years to reach tapping size, and that someday someone who lived here would tap them. May had thought about this. Will that be us? May said. Maggie looked at her. May was 8 years old and was entirely serious. Maybe, Maggie said, if you want to live here someday. May considered this with the uncomplicated pragmatism of 8 years old. I'd have to be old, she said, like almost 40. Approximately, Maggie said. That's okay, May said, and went back to her dinner with the settled authority of someone who has made a decision and moved on. Maggie kept this exchange. She turned it over in her mind in the days after the family had gone back to Virginia, standing at the kitchen window in the evenings, with her coffee, looking at the barn in the last light. She thought about May saying that's okay. She thought about Roy planting the maples and saying somebody will. She thought about the specific thread of continuity that ran between those two moments, separated by 9 years, in a death, in a foreclosure proceeding, in a deed that had waited 39 years in a tin lockbox on a high shelf in a barn. Things pass forward. Not automatically, not without care, not without the people who were willing to receive what had been prepared for them, and willing in turn to prepare something for whoever came next. It required the receivers as much as the preparers. Roy had prepared. May, who did not know she was doing it, had indicated her willingness to receive. 6 weeks after the auction, in the second week of January, Eleanor Pruitt sent a letter paper, not email, because the county records office communicated by paper, which Maggie appreciated, confirming that the formal title determination had been completed. Parcel 9C-2 was confirmed as a separately deeded parcel under filing, 85-C-441, with clear chain of title in Roy Holloway's name, and upon his death in 2019 in Maggie's name as the surviving heir under Connecticut intestate succession law. The parcel was not and never had been part of Parcel 4A for the purposes of the foreclosure instrument. The bank's attorneys, not Caldwell, who had apparently passed the matter to someone else, had reviewed the determination and confirmed they did not intend to challenge it. The letter was correct and professional and said in the careful language of legal institutions. What needed to be said, the barn was hers. She read the letter at Roy's oak table with her morning coffee. The light was coming in through the east kitchen window. The January light, which was different from November light and different from the summer light she had watched come through that window for 41 years, but which was the same window and the same morning and the same table, and which had the same quality of specificity and honesty that characterized the light in that room in that valley at that time of day. The foreclosure on Parcel 4A was another matter still to be worked through, still requiring negotiations and time and patience and whatever resolution was available. But the barn was not part of that problem. The barn was on Parcel 9C2, and Parcel 9C2 was hers. She folded the letter carefully the way Roy would have folded it along the existing creases, and she put it in the lockbox with the deed and the lien filing and the original structural assessment from 1982 because it belonged there with the other documents that were the barn's history, the record of how it had come to be what it was and whose it was and why. She put the lockbox back on the high shelf where Roy had always kept it. She went back to the kitchen and finished her coffee. A letter arrived from Brent Sauer in late January, not through his attorney, a personal letter written by hand on plain paper, the handwriting of a contractor, large, unpracticed, honest. He wrote that he had been thinking about the situation, that he wanted her to know he bore no ill will. He had done his due diligence, he said, and the auction had been legitimate, and he had not known about the deed filing, and he was not claiming otherwise. But he also said, and this was the part Maggie read twice, that he had talked to his wife about it, and his wife had pointed out that there were some things you didn't need to have, and this was one of them. He wished her well with the farm. He hoped everything worked out. She wrote back. She thanked him for the letter, and she said she hoped his contracting business was well, and she meant it because he had not done anything wrong, and she had not wanted a villain, and he had not been one. People were frequently not villains. They were frequently people who were doing what seemed reasonable to them from where they stood, and what seemed reasonable changed when they stood somewhere different. Caldwell had not been a villain. Sauer had not been a villain. The bank was an institution, and institutions were not villains. They were systems, and systems did what systems were designed to do until someone brought the right information to the right point in the process, and the system responded as it was designed to respond. Roy had known how systems worked. He had known that the record was the point of leverage within a system, that what you put into the record was what you could rely on when the system was engaged. He had put the right thing in the record at the right time, and when the time came to engage the system, the record had done its work. In February, 6 weeks after the title determination, Maggie drove back to Litchfield. This time she was not going to the records office. She was going to the county courthouse for a meeting with an attorney named Patricia Harlow, who handled debt restructuring for rural property owners and who had been recommended by a colleague of Danny's who knew the Connecticut property landscape. Patricia Harlow was 61, precise, and not inclined toward false optimism, which Maggie appreciated. She sat across from Patricia Harlow in an office that was functional and well-organized in the way of offices whose inhabitants are busy and serious about their work, and she explained her situation and put her documents on the desk, and Patricia Harlow looked at all of it and asked questions that were specific and answerable. At the end of the meeting, Patricia said what she could do and what it would cost and what the likely outcomes were, and she said these things without softening them or making them more encouraging than they were. And Maggie listened and understood and asked her own questions, which were specific and practical. She drove home with a plan, not a perfect plan, not a certain one, but a plan that was grounded in the actual situation rather than in what she wished the situation to be, and that had reasonable prospects of working, and that required what any serious plan required: patience, attention, and the willingness to do the work over the time it took. She would work with Patricia Harlow on a restructuring agreement with the bank. The barn, confirmed as a separately deeded parcel, could potentially be used as leverage in those negotiations, not sold, but recognized as an asset that had value and that demonstrated her stake in the property. Patricia had seemed interested in this possibility in the way that attorneys are interested in structural advantages that appear in a case with a specific focused interest that was different from general encouragement. It would take time. These things always took time. She was comfortable with time. She had spent her life with a man who thought in decades, who planted maples for a future he would not see, who filed deeds against problems that had not yet materialized and might never materialize, who built workbenches from lumber. He had air dried for 18 months because he didn't want to rush what shouldn't be rushed. She could do time. She drove home on the familiar roads in the gray February afternoon, past the stone walls and the bare fields and the hill line that she had been looking at for 41 years, and she thought about all of it: the deed, the barn, the workbench, the maples, the girls, the inscription under the apron board, and she felt, which was surprising to her, not the weight of the difficulty she was still in, but something else, something that was closer to the feeling you have when you are standing in a sound structure in bad weather, and the structure is doing what it was built to do. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter and more fundamental than either of those things. She thought about Roy saying somebody will. She was still here. Danny was still here in the sense that Danny was a phone call away, a presence she could rely on, a man who came when it mattered and stayed when he was needed, and understood what the barn meant without needing it explained. His daughters were still here in the sense that they were growing and learning and asking questions, and one of them had already decided with the casual authority of 8 years old that the tapping of the maples was an acceptable part of whatever her future would eventually look like. Somebody will. She turned into the driveway and parked and sat for a moment the way she often did, looking at the farmhouse and the barn from the car before going in. It was a habit she had not meant to develop. It had developed itself somewhere in the years after Roy died, this moment of looking before entering, as if the property needed to be confirmed, still present before she approached it, or as if she needed to confirm it needed the daily act of seeing it whole and standing to proceed to the next part of the day. The barn was there. The farmhouse was there. The stone walls and the bare February fields and the ridge beyond them and the maples on the south edge, 7 of them spindly and patient in the winter afternoon, 33 years from their purpose. She got out of the car and went inside. Spring came the way it always came to the Connecticut hills. Not all at once, not with the dramatic declarations of the seasons they showed in films, but incrementally specific advancement. By specific advancement, each day, slightly different from the day before, in ways that only people who live in a place year-round and pay attention know how to read. The red-winged blackbirds arriving at the feeder on the south side of the house in the last days of February before the snow had finished. The first mud in the driveway in mid-March, which Roy had always called mud season, with a specific inflection that distinguished it from mere muddiness, meaning the period when the frost came out of the ground and the land became temporarily impassable in ways it was not during the rest of the year. The spice bush along the stone wall putting out its small yellow flowers in late March before any of the trees had leafed. The flowers catching the low spring light with an intensity out of proportion to their size. Maggie watched all of this from the places she had watched it from for 41 years, and it looked as it always had, the way that familiar things look when you have seen them often enough that you are no longer seeing them for the first time and are seeing them instead for the true time, which is to say as themselves without the overlay of novelty. She had planted the kitchen garden in April, the same window she had been planting in since 1985, and the bed had been there every year since, and would be there every year she was alive to put seeds in it. The work of planting was the same work it had always been, which was the point of it, the preparation of the soil, the measurement of the rows, the careful spacing of the seeds, the reading of what each variety needed, and the provision of what each variety needed. The same problem is solved the same way with the same tools in the same hands. The work did not change because the world changed. The soil required what it required. The seeds required what they required. Your hands did the same things they had always done. This was, she had discovered, over years of doing it, a source of stability that was different from any other kind, because it was not mental stability or emotional stability, but something more physical than either of those, a stability that lived in the hands and in the body's memory of repeated action. In the specific knowledge of what a row needs to be to support this variety, and what depth and what spacing, and what this particular soil will do after a wet spring versus a dry one. Roy had understood this about physical work. It was one of the things he had tried with varying success to explain to Danny when Danny was young and impatient with the slowness of learning to do things right. The value of the repeated action is not the thing produced, Roy had said, or something like this. Roy had not been a man who gave speeches about what things meant, but he had said things occasionally that Maggie had heard and kept. The value of the repeated action is what it makes of your hands, and what it makes of your hands is what you are. She was in the garden on a Wednesday afternoon in April when the car came up the driveway. She didn't recognize it, a dark blue sedan, unfamiliar. She stood and watched it park. 2 people got out, a man and a woman, perhaps in their early 40s. They stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse and then at the barn with the specific attentiveness of people who are seeing a place they have thought about and are now checking what they thought against what is actually there. She pulled off her garden gloves and walked toward them. The man's name was Thomas Adler, and the woman's name was his wife Helen. They had come from New Milford, 40 minutes south. They had heard about the barn, someone had told someone who had told them the telephone of small communities, and they had come because Thomas was a cabinet maker. Self-taught working out of a garage that was too small and too poorly lit and not built for the work. And someone had mentioned that there was a restored post and beam barn in Millhaven with a proper workbench, and it might be worth asking about. Maggie looked at him for a moment. "Did you come to see the workbench?" she said. Thomas Adler looked slightly uncertain. "I didn't want to presume." "Come see the workbench," she said. She brought them to the barn. She opened the door and stood aside and let them go in, and she watched them stop just inside the door the way everyone stopped taking the space in before moving through it. Thomas went to the workbench and stood before it. He was a man who worked with wood. She could see it in the way he looked at it, which was not the general appreciation of someone who found it attractive, but the specific attention of someone who was assessing it as a piece of work. He ran his hands along the top surface. He tried the leg vise, which swung smoothly cleaned and tuned by Danny in November. He looked at the drawers with their wooden runners. He crouched and looked at the apron board, not at the inscription which he could not have known about, but at the joinery, the way the apron was attached, and the quality of the fit. He stood up. He looked at the framing above him, and then at the floor, and then at the windows. "How old is the barn?" he said. "The structure is mid-19th century," she said. "My husband restored it, starting in 1982. The workbench he built in 1984. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the post and beam framing. "White oak and chestnut," he said. "He left it almost entirely intact," she said. "Cleaned and reinforced. 2 replacement posts." Thomas nodded slowly. He was having the conversation that woodworkers have when they encounter something that was made well, which is a conversation that happens largely through looking and touching and does not require many words. Helen had been looking at the east windows and at the light that came through them, and at the way the light lay across the floor. She turned to Maggie. "What do you do with it?" she said. She meant now currently in its present use. "I come and stand in it," Maggie said, "and I'm thinking about what comes next." She said this without planning to say it, and once she said it, she recognized it as the truest answer to the question. Thomas looked at her. "My son is 7, he said. "I've been wanting to teach him to use a plane." He looked at the workbench. "I've been doing this in my garage, and it's not right. The space isn't right. The space affects the work." Maggie thought about Roy saying the value of the repeated action is what it makes of your hands. "Yes," she said, "it does." She talked with Thomas and Helen for an hour in the barn, and then in the kitchen over coffee, and then the conversation expanded in the way that conversations expand when the people having them are interested in the right things and comfortable enough to say so. Thomas had left a corporate job 8 years ago to work wood full-time. He made custom cabinets and furniture. He was not making a fortune, but he was making a living, and he was making things that lasted. And the combination of those two facts was, he said, enough. Helen was a teacher, elementary school, 3rd grade, which made Maggie smile in a way that Thomas noticed, but did not ask about. Before they left, Thomas said carefully that if she ever wanted to think about making the barn available for use, not as a business exactly, or not necessarily, but simply for the kind of work it had been built for, he would be interested in that conversation. Maggie said she would be interested in that conversation too. She stood in the driveway and watched their car go back down the road, and she thought about Danny's idea in November, about the workshop space, about the barn, as a working place rather than a memorial. She thought about Roy's workbench under someone else's hands, a cabinet maker's hands, the hands of a man who worked seriously and wanted the space to be right for the work. She thought about a 7-year-old learning to use a plane. She thought about Roy at 8 years old standing at his father's shoulder, watching how the hands moved and beginning slowly to understand. She went back inside. She sat at the kitchen table. She took out a notepad and a pen, and she began to write things down. Not a plan exactly, but the beginning of a plan, the outline of what a plan might be, the list of questions that a plan would need to answer before it could become a one. She wrote slowly and specifically the way she did everything, and she wrote for an hour. And when she was finished, she looked at what she had written, and she thought it was the beginning of something. She put the notepad in the drawer of the kitchen table where she kept things in progress, things she had not yet finished thinking about, but intended to finish thinking about. Then she got up and put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn in the late afternoon light. The barn was there. It was the same barn it had been this morning and yesterday and last November, and in November of 1983, when Roy had filed the lien notice, and in June of 1985, when he had filed the deed, And in October of 1982, when he had re-roofed it as the first task because the water was always the first question. It was the same building, but it was also the accumulated version of itself, layered with everything that had happened in it and around it, and because of it over 40 years. And that accumulation was not a weight, but a depth. The specific depth of a thing that has been in one place and used seriously for a long time, and has therefore become in some way that is hard to articulate, but easy to feel when you are standing in it more itself than it was when it started. The light was going in the way it goes in April later than February, but still earlier than June, still retreating toward the ridge at an angle that left the bottom of the valley in shadow, while the top of the ridge held light. The maples on the south edge were leafing out the first leaves of their eighth spring, small and pale green and translucent in the backlight, the specific delicacy of new growth in the first days when the leaves have not yet toughened to their summer density, but are still the tender, almost not their green of beginning. 32 years from tapping, give or take. 32 years from the morning that May, now 8, would be 40, and perhaps living on this land if she wanted to, if she chose to, if the thread held, and would walk out to the south edge of the property on the first warm day of late winter and drill the tap holes and collect the sap in buckets, the way people in this part of the country had been collecting it for as long as people had been in this part of the country. She did not know if this would happen. She could not know. Roy had not known whether his trees would be tapped either. He had planted them anyway. The act of planting was not a bet on the future so much as a statement about it, that it was real, that it was worth preparing for, that what you did now in good faith would be available to whoever came after you. The kettle was boiling. She turned away from the window and poured the water over the tea and stood in the warm kitchen and thought about Thomas Adler's son learning to use a plane. She thought about the first time a young hand rested on Roy's workbench and felt the wood under it and began to understand through touch what the grain of the wood meant and what the plane needed to do to work with it and what it meant for the work to go right. That would happen. She was increasingly certain it would happen. The space would be used, the bench would be used, the knowledge of how to do things right would move from one pair of hands to the next pair of hands, which was always how it had moved, which was the only way it could move, which was why the spaces where it happened mattered so much and why Roy had built this one the way he had. She took her tea to the table. She sat down. She opened the notepad to the page where she had been writing, and she read over what she had written, and she picked up the pen and she added 2 more lines to the list. Outside, the last light left the bottom of the valley, and the barn became a darker shape against the darkening landscape, and the first stars appeared in the pale upper sky above the ridge. The late April sky still bright enough at the horizon to show the tree line in detail, the maples and the oaks and the birches, the specific and familiar profile of the land she had lived on for 41 years, which was the same land it had always been and always would be underneath. Whatever changed on its surface and which held in its record, in the county files in Litchfield, in the tin lockbox on the high shelf in the barn, in the inscription carved under the apron board, the accumulated evidence of everything that had been done there in good faith and that would be there for whoever came looking. The restructuring agreement with the bank was finalized in June. Patricia Harlow had negotiated carefully and specifically, and the result was not everything Maggie had hoped for, but was what the situation warranted: a restructured payment schedule that reflected her actual income and the actual value of the property, with parcel 9C-2 formally excluded from the encumbrance, and a clear timeline and a clear path forward. She signed the documents at Patricia's office in Litchfield on a Thursday afternoon, and Patricia walked her through each page with the same precise, unsentimental attention she had brought to everything. And when it was done, she shook Maggie's hand and said, "You have a clear position, stay with the payments and you'll be fine." Maggie said she understood. She drove home through Litchfield and through the June countryside, the Connecticut hills at their fullest, the hayfields in their first cutting of the season. She thought about what it meant to have a clear position, to know exactly where you stood, what you owed, what the path looked like from here. A clear position was not the same as an easy position. It was simply a position you could work from. Hard work done from a clear position was just work. Roy had always operated this way. He had assessed the barn in 1982 before making an offer. He had filed the lien in 1983 before any ambiguity could arise. He had completed the deed in 1985 so that the record was not implied but explicit. Every step was a step toward clarity, toward the truth made permanent in the record. She was working from that position now. It had taken 40 years to arrive at it, and Roy had built most of it, but she had found it, and she was using it, and that was enough. The summer was busy. She and Thomas Adler had several more conversations by phone, and then in person about the barn. Danny had driven up in late May for a weekend, and the three of them had walked the barn together and talked about what a working arrangement might look like and what it would require. The conversation had been specific and practical, which was the only kind of conversation that was useful when the subject was a real thing rather than an idea. What they arrived at by early July was simple. Thomas would have access to the barn 3 days a week for his cabinet work, in exchange for a monthly contribution that would go toward the barn's maintenance costs and a portion of the property tax allocation for parcel 9C-2. He would also be responsible for the barn on the days he used it, the opening and the closing, the basic housekeeping, the condition of the tools. He could bring his son on weekends. The arrangement was not a lease. It was not a formal rental agreement. It was an arrangement between two people who understood what the barn was and what it was for, and who had agreed on the terms in plain language and who would keep the agreement because that was the kind of people they were. Maggie had written it up in a simple one-page document, both parties' signatures dated July 8th. She had put a copy in the kitchen drawer where she kept things in progress, and another copy in the lockbox in the barn, beside the deed and the lien filing, and the title determination letter, and the structural assessment from 1982. The lockbox was getting full, which felt right. Thomas started in July. He arrived on his first day with his tools in the back of his truck, planes and chisels and marking gauges and saws, the specific vocabulary of the hand woodworker, organized in the ways that each person organizes their tools, according to the logic that makes sense to them. And he spent the first 2 hours of the morning simply being in the barn, getting oriented, learning the light and the temperature and the way the space felt at different times of the day. Maggie had left him to it. She had gone back to the house and done her own work, and she had not gone out to the barn until the early afternoon when she brought coffee, and there was no particular reason to bring it, except that it seemed right the way it had seemed right every morning for years to bring coffee to Roy at the workbench. Thomas was at the bench working a piece of white oak, with a jack plane taking the rough surface down in long strokes, reading the grain as he went. She set the coffee on the end of the bench and watched him work for a moment. His attention was on the grain ahead of the plane, not on the plane itself, which was how you knew someone who understood what they were doing. The tool was not the point. The material was the point. She thought about Roy. She thought about standing in this barn 40 years ago and watching Roy work before Danny was born, before the barn was finished, when they were still learning what this place was and what it would become. She had stood in that same position at the edge of the barn near the door, not wanting to interrupt, and watched his hands move along a piece of wood and understood, watching him, something about the nature of attention that she had not fully understood before. You could be absorbed in something, and it was not the same as being absent. You could be entirely in the work and still be entirely present in the place where the work was happening. This was a thing Roy did that she had not seen many people do. He was completely in what he was doing and completely in the room. And the two states were not in conflict, but were somehow the same state. Thomas was doing this now. He was in his work and in the barn, and both things were fully present and neither diminished the other. She watched him, and she felt something that was the right response to it, which was not sentiment, but something truer than sentiment, a recognition of the thing continuing the work, continuing the barn being used for what it had been built for the hands of a serious craftsman moving along Roy's workbench for the first time, but not the last. She left him to his coffee and his work and went back to the house. In the evening, as she was making dinner, her phone rang. It was Danny. "How's the first day?" he said. "Good," she said. "He's good. He knows what he's doing." A pause, and she could hear in the pause the specific quality of Danny's satisfaction, which was always quiet. "Dad would have watched him," Danny said. "He would have," she said, "and then he would have made some coffee and set it on the end of the bench without saying anything." A silence. "You did that?" Danny said. "I brought coffee," she said. She heard him laugh, a short, genuine laugh, the laugh that meant something had arrived precisely where it needed to arrive. "Good," he said. September brought the change of light that September always brought in the Connecticut hills. the angle dropping the shadows, lengthening the quality of the afternoon, becoming the gold of late summer, retreating from the warmth it had had in August towards something more austere and more beautiful and more honest. The maples in the woodlot on the north end of the property began their annual transformation before the sugar maples on the south edge did, which were younger and slower to commit to the season. Maggie watched them from the kitchen window and from the porch and from the path along the stone wall on her evening walks. Thomas came on his 3 days every week, and his son came on Saturday mornings. The boy was named Jacob, and he was 7 years old, and he was at the stage of learning where everything is still primarily about watching and touching and asking questions before the hands begin to understand on their own. He watched his father work with the focused, unself-conscious attention of a child who is genuinely interested and not performing interest. He asked questions that were sometimes very specific and sometimes very large, the way children's questions range between these extremes without warning. One Saturday in September, he asked Maggie, who happened to be in the barn, checking the condition of a section of floor near the east wall that she had been keeping an eye on since the spring, what the letters under the workbench said. He had found them on his own the way children find things by crouching down to look at something that was at his eye level and being too curious not to read it. She crouched down beside him and looked at the inscription with him. The letters were small and clean, carved with Roy's precision, unchanged since the summer of 1986. Maggie Holloway, age 8, first flat tire, June 14th, 1986. Those are my son's words, she said. About my son. My husband carved them there. Jacob looked at her. Why? She thought about how to answer this. She thought about what Roy would have said, which would have been something very direct and very simple. Because it was important, she said. It was the first time Danny learned to fix something himself, and Roy wanted to remember it, and he wanted it to be permanent. Permanent means it stays, Jacob said. That's right, she said. It's been there longer than I've been alive, Jacob said, making a calculation. Much longer, she said. Jacob looked at the inscription for another moment. Then he straightened and went back to watching his father work the piece of wood he had been watching before. And Maggie straightened, too, and looked at the floorboard she had come to check, and the barn was quiet except for the sound of the plane moving along the grain, and the shavings falling, and the particular silence of a place that is being used carefully for what it was built for. Later, after Thomas and Jacob had left, and the barn was hers again, she went to the workbench, and she crouched down and looked at the inscription herself. She had looked at it many times now. It looked the same as it had always looked, which was small and specific and permanent. She put her finger on Danny's name the way Danny had done in November, the way she had done the first time she found it. The carving was clean under her fingertip. The letters were exactly as Roy had made them in the summer of 1986 with whatever chisel he had chosen because it was the right size for the job. She thought about Roy carving this in the summer of 1986 with Danny not yet 2 years old. Danny, who would not be able to read it for several years, who would not understand what it meant for many years after that. Roy had not carved it for Danny to see immediately. He had carved it because it had happened and because it was true and because the workbench was the right place to put it. He had carved it, and then he had moved on, the way he moved on from everything he had completed without needing the completion to be witnessed or acknowledged or praised. This was the thing she thought. This was the pattern that ran through everything, the lien notice, the deed, the maple trees, the inscription. Roy did not do things for the immediate return. He did not need the return to be immediate or visible or acknowledged. He did what needed to be done in the right way at the right time, and he trusted that what he put into the record, the official record, the unofficial record, the record that was this workbench and this barn and this land, would be there when it was needed. And it was there. It was all there. It had waited patient as stone in the dry and the dark for the moment when someone needed it. And when the moment came, she had found it and she had used it, and it had done what he had made it to do. The barn was quiet. The afternoon light was going. Through the east windows, the sky was turning toward the pale blue of September evening, the light that had no particular name, but that she knew the way. She knew all the lights of that valley by heart, by long familiarity, by the accumulated recognition of having seen it many times and always finding it the same. She stood up. She put her hand on the workbench the way she always did. She stood there for a moment. Then she turned off the overhead light and walked to the door and let herself out and closed the door behind her and made sure the latch was seated, the way Roy had always made sure the latch was seated, because the latch was what kept the door true in its frame, and the door being true in its frame was what kept the weather out. And the weather being out was what kept the barn dry, and the barn being dry was what kept the structure sound, and the structure being sound was everything. She walked back across the yard toward the house in the September evening, past the gate, in the fence along the stone path, and she thought about all of it, the whole long story of it. Roy's story and her story and Danny's story and the barn story, which were all the same story, and she felt what she felt, which was the right thing to feel in a life that had been, despite everything, built on solid ground. Maggie had thought about Roy's way of keeping records for months, turning it over in the way you turn over something that has more facets than you initially saw. He had believed in putting things into the official record, the county index, the filing system at the town hall, the deed registry, because these systems, imperfect and slow as they were governed, and what was in them mattered in ways that what was merely true did not always matter. He had believed in the unofficial record too, the inscription under the apron board, the maple trees on the south edge, the workbench built from lumber. He had air-dried himself because some truths needed to be put somewhere more personal than a filing cabinet and more permanent than memory. He had done both. She thought about this in October, when the foliage peaked and the hills took on the specific amber and crimson of the Connecticut hills at their season. She thought about it on the morning walk she took each day along the stone wall on the north side of the property, where the wall curved gently with the line of the old field edge, and where the lichen on the stones had been growing for at least as long as the wall had been standing, which was at least a century, possibly longer. The kind of thing you could not date exactly, but which you could estimate from the size of the lichen colonies and the degree of the stone's integration into the soil and the way the wall had settled into the landscape, as if it had always been there, which was the criterion Roy had used for good-built work, when it looks as if it could not be otherwise, when it looks as if it belongs entirely to its place and its purpose, it is right. She thought about it in the evenings at Roy's oak table with her tea and her reading, in the specific warmth of the kitchen in October, when the furnace had been running for 3 weeks, and the house had reached its winter temperature and held it with the solidity of a well-insulated structure that had been weatherized with care. She thought about it most clearly in the barn. She went to the barn every few days more on the days when Thomas was not there than on the days he was, though both kinds of visits were good in their different ways. On the days Thomas was there, the barn was a working place, warm with the specific warmth of productive work, with the smell of fresh shavings, and the sound of planes and the quiet conversation of two people sharing a space with mutual respect. On the days he was not there, it was the barn in its own state, which was quieter and older and more concentrated, the accumulation of everything that had happened there present in it, the way the past is present in a place that has been used seriously for a long time. On an afternoon in late October, she brought a chair to the barn, one of the ladder-back chairs from the kitchen, which she carried easily because they were light, Roy having built them with the specific economy of a craftsman who considered weight in proportion to structural necessity and put no more material into a thing than it needed. And she set it in the middle of the barn floor, in the light from the east windows, and she sat in it, and she looked at the workbench, and she thought. She thought about what she would tell Danny when he came for Christmas, because she intended to tell him things she had not told him yet, not because she had been withholding them, but because she had not finished thinking about them, and she did not speak about things she had not finished thinking about. Roy had taught her this by example, by being the person in the room who waited until he had something specific to say, rather than saying things on the way to something specific. She had something specific to say now. She intended to tell him that she had decided to stay. This was not news to Danny, but she wanted to say it explicitly, to put it in the record of their conversations in a way that he would know she had chosen it, rather than simply remained in it by default. There was a difference. Roy had chosen to be what he was, renewed that choice each time circumstances created the option to make a different one, and the choosing was part of what it meant to be the thing he was. She intended to tell him about Thomas Adler's son, about Jacob crouching under the workbench and reading the inscription and saying that permanent means it stays. She intended to tell him about the possibility of a few Saturday workshops in the spring, nothing commercial, just the barn, made available to people who wanted to learn to work wood in the right kind of space. She intended to tell him that the knowledge of how to do things right moved from hands to hands, and it was worth knowing whose hands had been in the chain. She sat in the October light in the barn in the ladder-back chair at the center of the floor, And she looked at the workbench, at the tools on the south wall, at the framing above her white oak and chestnut original, to the structure preserved and reinforced and now permanent in a way that was both structural and historical. The kind of permanence that only comes to things that were made honestly and maintained honestly over a long time. She was 73 years old and she was in the barn her husband had rebuilt. And she was thinking about the future, which was not the same as planning the future or controlling it, but which was the thing that preceded both of those. The act of imagining it clearly, of taking it seriously, of treating it as real rather than abstract as something that would happen to actual people in an actual place, and that what you did now mattered to what it would be. Roy had thought about the future. He had thought about it practically and had done practical things about it and had not needed to announce that he was doing it or explain why it was worth doing. He had simply done it and the future had arrived and what he had done had mattered. She would do the same. She would stay on this land and tend this garden and care for this barn and work with Thomas Adler and learn Jacob's name better and watch the maples grow on the south edge and write things in the notepad in the kitchen drawer and sit at Roy's oak table with her morning coffee and look out the east window at the barn in whatever light the season and the day and the hour produced, and she would be here. She would be the person who was here. That was the work. It was not spectacular work. It was not the kind of work that attracted attention or recognition. It was the work of being present in a specific place over a long time, which Roy would have called the most important work, because it was the work that made everything else possible. The light in the east windows was going. The October afternoon was drawing down toward its early dark, the specific and slightly melancholy dark of mid-October in the hills. When the afternoon retreats faster than summer has taught you to expect, and the evening comes on before you are entirely ready for it. The barn was dimming around her. The workbench was a long, pale shape in the shadows. Above her, the framing was losing its detail to the dark. She stood. She picked up the chair. She carried it to the door. She paused at the door in the habit she had always had, the pause at the threshold, the small moment of transition between the barn and the world outside it. She looked back at the interior, the long, pale shape of the bench, the tools barely visible on their pegs, the framing above old wood and old shadow. She thought, this is a good barn. Not because it was beautiful, though. It was beautiful in the way that serious, well-made things are beautiful. Not because it was hers, though it was hers. It was parcel 9C-2 deed 85-C-4, 41 her name on the record. Not even because of what it meant, the whole long story of Roy and the filing numbers and the lockbox in November morning in the community hall. She thought it was a good barn because it was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was sound and dry and honest and used for what it was built for, and the work done in it was real work done by real hands, and it would become, in the things those hands made, something that outlasted the making. This was all a barn needed to be. This was what Roy had given it and what she had protected and what Thomas Adler was now adding to each day he came, each shaving that fell from his plane and curled on the floor of old ash planking, each piece of furniture that left the barn in the back of his truck to stand in someone's house for 50 years or 100. She stepped out into the October evening. She pulled the door closed behind her. She set the latch. She walked back across the yard in the last of the October light, carrying the chair on the stone path Roy had laid in the summer of 1987 past the fence and the gate back to the farmhouse, back to the kitchen window, in the evening and the table and the tea, and the particular warmth of a house that has been lived in for a long time by people who have taken care of it, and she went inside. Some men speak through words. Some men speak through the work they do with their hands, through the things they build, and the records they keep, and the small, careful acts that constitute over a life the argument they have been making all along about what matters and what is true and what is worth protecting. Roy Holloway had made his argument across 40 years in wood and in the county filing system, and in the 1-acre deed and in the maple trees and in the inscription on the underside of an apron board, and the argument was clear, and it was in the record, and it would stay there. She put water on for tea. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the barn was a dark shape against the October sky, and the sky above the ridge still held the last of the day's light, the thinnest edge of amber at the horizon, which was the October sky, doing what it had always done in that valley, in that specific place, at the end of those specific days, which was to hold on a little longer than you thought it would, and then to go finally into the dark and leave behind the stars and the familiar outline of the ridge and the sounds of the night settling in and the record of what had been here permanent, patient, exactly as it was meant to be.